Now, the practicality. You know, teaching an anxiety class, it's pretty evident to me that people need to be kind of walk through things. So I wrote a workbook on anxiety whereby I taught them about the brain, and we go chapter by chapter every week. I have a whole chapter on nutritional neuroscience in here. What foods aren't so good to eat if you're anxious? How important is it to eat the right balanced foods? What parts of your brains are overactive? What's going on with anxiety? Short and fast routes. People with anxiety disorders have got the fast route overactive. And I say, you know what? We need the slow route involved here. What do we do with the slow route with you? We need you really to start doing things you don't feel like doing, as I was talking about before. What does that mean? Oh, you mean to tell me that I've got to stop avoiding? Absolutely. Avoidance is the enemy of your effort to get over anxiety. Exposure is the only way to get through this. But oh my God, that means that I'm going to be thrown into an abyss. I'm going to be eaten up. No, what we need to do is have bits and pieces of slow movement. This is where CBT is right. The evidence-based, the 5% of that pie that we showed before is so critical. We're not going to throw it out, and Dan Siegel and Alan Shore and others really aren't, they don't appreciate that 5%. I think the 5% has to be paid attention to, and that's where some of these areas like exposure or behavioral activation are so critical. You've got to include them as part of the whole picture. Remember earlier when we were talking about the big pie and outcome research, and Lloyd was saying, well, Michael Lambert and Scott Miller have taken a look at what is effective in treatment, the alliance, the common variables and all that, and it was just 5% that was the technique. And the technique essentially is evidence-based practice. Evidence-based practice largely is CBT. That's where most of the research is, and David Barlow from Boston University and others have been the spearheads in that area, and it's really CBT that they've been taking a look at, largely speaking. So we say you got to pay attention to this, to that portion of it, but it's not just CBT. Take a look at this. When you're dealing with anxiety, and now we're incorporating all the stuff we talked about earlier today, overactivation of the right prefrontal cortex is correlated with anxiety. Underactivation of the left prefrontal cortex. And I literally say this every time I'm working with either a person individually or in the group. So what does that mean? We need you getting doing small things. And I sometimes bring up this movie with Bill Murray in it. What about Bob? Baby Steps. And you know, he was far more functional in many ways than Richard Dreyfuss was. You know, here's this arrogant psychiatrist and all that who came up with the baby step idea, and Bob says, oh, I get it now, baby steps, right? Well, I use that and everybody cracks up and all that, and I said, you really literally, that's what we have to do. Those baby steps are really part of the exposure. We're not going to throw you into the pool and say swim, but we're certainly not going to sit around and analyze this to death. And I come from a psychodynamic background too. I mean, after that whole era in the early 70s, I was steeped in the psychodynamic theory. It's interesting to me, but still you got to get people to do things they don't feel like doing. And what does that do? Activate the left prefrontal cortex. Remember, approach behaviors with the left prefrontal cortex. Withdrawal behaviors with the right prefrontal cortex. There was a slide earlier when Lloyd was going through the stress section that was called the stone tablet versus the Etch-a-Sketch. And what I say to them is essentially that. I say the amygdala has to get worn down because it can't forget. And that makes evolutionary sense because of the slow versus the fast route. I sometimes talk like this. What we need to do with habituation, I don't use the word habituation, but I say really wear it down. Wear down the overactivity of the amygdala down. So what we need to do is involve your cortex. So certainly all that CBT stuff is important. What you tell yourself when you're going through this exposure experience is critically important. That's where the cognitive restructuring comes into effect. Oh, what does that involve? Well, that involves basically all these cognitive sets. assumptions, automatic thoughts, and core beliefs. So I go through, what are the automatic thoughts? You walk into the room and you go, oh my God, look at all these people. You mean I'm going to make a fool out of myself? I'm really bad in front of people. That's the theory and the assumptions. And the core beliefs, I'm really a kind of a rotten person. I'm really not that great of a person. It's like layers of an onion, and what you say to yourself when you're going through this exposure experience needs to be rewired. So your brain essentially needs to be rewired so that you can have inhibiting control over your amygdala and wear it down or go through this habituation. So in a sense, I'm kind of reinforcing the CBT belief in cognitive restructuring. And I'm making it brain-based by saying that, remember, you got a stone tablet, you got to chip away at this thing, because it's not like you can come in with an insight and ding, everything's fine again. Essentially what we're doing is we're demystifying psychology. Yeah. And there's so much myth out there about what we do and our theories and all that, and oftentimes people shop around for the correct little theory. What we're trying to do is integrate it all, and if you don't make it relevant to the brain and talk about the brain, then you risk the mystification, and they go off not knowing why you're asking them to do something. If you make it relevant and you say that, look, we learned a heck of a lot during the last 10 years, and you got an overactive amygdala, we got to tame your amygdala, and this is the way we do it. And sure, yeah, it feels better to avoid things that make you uncomfortable. And people say, well, my God, isn't it better to kind of go with your feelings and make them soothed? And I essentially say, if you want to stay the way you are, do that. That's good. But we're talking about bumping the needle like you have a broken record. We have to attack the causes of you staying the same. And these are the layers of avoidance. So the obvious ones are escape. You escape things that make you anxious. You walk into a room and there are all these people and you just leave. Or you don't even go in. You heard there's some people in there. Or you avoid it until the very last minute and then go in and be overwhelmed because you've been so overwhelmed with anticipatory anxiety. It's a terrible experience anyway. Those are ways to get your amygdala hyperactive. The more you avoid, the more areas that you'll probably experience that will make you anxious. So what about panic? Well, here's where there's a little bit of interesting both positives and negatives related to CBT. The CBT people are certainly into interoceptive exposure. And I think it makes a whole lot of sense because people with panic, for example, get overreactive to nuisance physical sensations. And we, in our anxiety groups, in every psychiatry department across Northern California, I think we've got about 20 across Northern California, has anxiety groups. And within the anxiety group, we often do interoceptive exposure. Why? We want to teach people to have tachycardia and get comfortable with it, or have shortness of breath. So in my anxiety group, I say, okay, you're so afraid of having your heart beat faster or breathe quickly. What we want to do is induce it right now. What are you talking about? You want to induce my shortness of breath? And I say, absolutely, because what you've learned to do is get reactive to it. We want you to tell yourself all you're doing is breathing fast. It's not that big of a deal. And you're going to do that throughout your life. So let's run in place right now. So I time them and I'm running with them for about 2 minutes, 2.5 minutes. And I say, okay, how did everybody feel? Oh my God, I started to feel lightness in my heart. Then I started to have racing thoughts and everything. I said, yeah, that's typically what happened. But you know what? We're now in a protective environment. This is a class. And what we're doing is really just saying, wow, I induced this. And I didn't have to go to the ER. I didn't have a heart attack. So we go through all these things, like spinning, for example. Well, some people get really hyperreactive to spinning and being dizzy. Or if you really want to induce shortness of breath, breathe through a straw. So we pass out straws and have people do that.